Okay, this is the first of a series of a walkthrough, or a quick run-through, I should say, of the text of Revelation. Firstly, dealing with the 7 churches. So, my plan for the rest of these recordings is to run through the text with you. It's going to be a brief sprint rather than a marathon all the way through, but we will look at each of these sections of the book, looking at the 7 churches, the seals, the trumpets, the signs, the 7 bowls, the Babylon, millennium, and then the end. And when it comes to most of the book, this major body of the letter, we will look to see how these 4 views interpret the different parts of the text. But first, let's look at these 7 churches. Who was the original audience of this letter? So we're going to do a little bit more background now, looking at each of these churches in turn and what we know about them. So, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These are all in the Roman province of Asia, on the western side of what we now know as Turkey. Now, we know from Acts that these aren't the only churches in Asia. We know from Acts that Troas, for example, and Colossae from Colossians are all in this province. So there are more churches than these 7. So that raises a question. Why these 7? Why did John write to these 7 churches in particular? This has led many people to think, be highly suspicious of his choice of 7. Again, looking at how numbers is used in this literature, how 7 signifies as complete. So maybe these 7 churches represent all of the church of Asia. So by choosing 7, he's in fact choosing all. Or maybe it's a bigger picture of that. Maybe these 7 churches represent the entire church of that time, or maybe the entire church of all time. And so different views will often look at these first few chapters and wonder what they say about the whole church, not just about these 7 specific churches. But more on that later. On the face of it, though, we have 7 churches in a rough circle around the trade routes of Asia. So these, and they are basically, they come in the order that you would get to as you walk along these roads. So Ephesus first being the port you get to first, the major port. And then as you go around these roads, you would come to Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea lastly. So, a brief background of these cities. Ephesus. We already know quite a bit about Ephesus from Ephesians. We have a huge port city here. Population possibly around 250,000 people at this time. Certainly the most important city in Asia and one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. This is the reason why Ephesus is first on the list. Practically speaking, if you sail to Asia, the most likely port you'll go to is Ephesus. It's the biggest port. And of course, it's the most important city and the most important church in this region. It was the gateway to Asia, both geographically and spiritually. Because if you remember from Acts, it was in Ephesus that Paul stayed for almost 3 years. And from there he used it as a base that all of the gospel spread around the province of Asia. So if you like, Ephesus is the mother church of this region. It's the first church. The church from where all the other churches came. If you remember back to Philemon, you get the idea and Colossians of how Epaphras went from Ephesus to Colossae. So Paul sent him from Ephesus to Colossae to found the church. So it's like Ephesus is the root of all of these churches. We also know that later Ephesus became John's home church. So he would have had responsibility over this region, over Ephesus and this region. It's possible that he succeeded Paul and Peter and Timothy, who had previously cared for this region and wrote letters to this region. Also the fact that John brought with him his adoptive mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus, also makes Ephesus a significant church, that Mary was there. But Ephesus was really important religiously. It was a huge religious center. Mostly because it's where the temple of Artemis was there. This was one of the wonders of the ancient world. The largest temple, largest building in the Greek world, and its most famous temple. Because this temple was so famous, it became the center of mother goddess worship throughout the empire. So people from different religions who didn't necessarily worship Artemis, but their religion had a mother fertility figure, they would go to Artemis's temple in order to worship. So it was a place of religious tourism, if you like. Many people would go there. And here you see on the right an artist depiction of the Temple of Artemis, this huge and incredible building. On the left there you see the amphitheater in Ephesus, which is where Paul was involved in a riot in that very building. Next, you see a statue of Artemis herself and a coin from Ephesus. This is interesting because you have the idea on this coin is called the Paradise of Artemis. You get this Artemis and a deer in a temple in front of a sacred palm tree. And in Revelation you have idea, I will give you from the tree of life in the paradise of God. And this is something you're going to see in all these letters as you look into them. Jesus and John take images from these churches, from these cities, to explain different things to them. So the contrast here in Ephesus is you have a choice. You can eat from the paradise of Artemis, or you can eat from the paradise of God. This is a ruin of a temple to the goddess Roma. Roma was the personification of the Roman Empire, and many would worship the Roman Empire through the goddess Roma. Here you have Augustus and Domitian. And Asia was, like I said before, a center for the emperor cult. And they were loyalty to the Roman Empire, and the families of the emperors were very strong in Ephesus and the letters around it. So it was very easy for these people to slip into emperor worship in temples such as these. This is the ruins of a temple dedicated to Domitian and his family. And in this very temple, people would worship the emperor Domitian and get the libellus and all that. Next you have Smyrna. Smyrna is modern-day Izmir, which makes it the only city on the list that still exists today. It was the second largest city in the province of Asia. So Ephesus was the first, and then Smyrna. But Smyrna had the reputation of being far more beautiful than Ephesus. It also had a connection with the emperor cult. In fact, it was the first city in this province to build a temple dedicated to Roma, this goddess of the Roman Empire. So it had a long experience of the emperor cult, long before Domitian made it law. Here you see the ruins of the agora of ancient Smyrna, and then behind it, modern Izmir. A quote from Cicero, "The city of our most faithful and most ancient allies." So again, this city was known for its loyalty and connection to the Roman state and its long history of emperor cult. Pergamum. Pergamum was the capital of Asia. So it was the seat of Roman government of the province of Asia. It also had the second largest library in the ancient world. Alexandria was the first, and then Pergamum. Over 200,000 different works there. It was the oldest city in this list. And it was also, and had another first, the first to build a temple dedicated to Augustus, when he became the head of all religions. It contained two other famous temples. One was to, that's a picture of the library there. One was to Asclepius, who was the god of healing, the Greek god of healing. And most of you probably recognize his sign if you don't recognize the name, because most ambulances and hospitals still bear the sign, the snake sign, which is the symbol for this god. And many people would travel to Pergamum to be healed in this temple. The other famous temple there was the altar to Zeus. Here you see it, it's reconstructed now in Berlin. This is a very famous building, a very famous temple. Many people say if it only been built a generation before, we'd be talking about the 8 wonders of the ancient world, not 7. It was so popular and so famous. One of the things about it, it was suspiciously throne-like in its shape. If you see the next picture, you see a model of Pergamum, and there in the center there is the altar to Zeus, and you can see it looks like a large throne. And so many people think that when Revelation speaks about Satan's throne being in Pergamum, it's actually talking about the temple of Zeus. Though also many people say because you have the connection with beast and emperor worship, and that Pergamum is the center of Roman power in Asia, Satan's throne could be talking about this political thing, not the temple of Zeus. The letter of Pergamum also talks about being given a white stone. And here are some examples of white stones from the period. And these white stones are Roman tesserets. And these were tokens that were given to people, and they're essentially tickets, so that you could enter the Colosseum or the amphitheater to see public events. So you would go to the amphitheater, show your white stone, and you'll be given access. So a white stone is the idea of being given access to something. Thyatira. Thyatira was the smallest and least significant city on the list, though ironically it has the longest letter of all these churches. It was famous though for purple cloth that it produced. If you remember Lydia in Acts, she was a seller of purple cloth from Thyatira. It might seem strange to us now, but in the ancient times it was very hard to dye clothes purple. It was the most expensive process of all dyeing process. Which is why purple had this association with royalty and those who were extremely rich, because only the rich could afford purple, because it was so expensive to produce. And one of the ways you made it was through a small plant that grows in this region, the madder plant. And so they would make purple from this plant. And so Thyatira, because they had a lot of this plant, became a center of purple making, which made it very rich. It was also known for its trade guilds centered around temples. This is not just in Thyatira, this is in many places around the Greek and Roman world. Trade would be associated with different gods, and then you would go and meet, have business discussion in the temple of the god that your trade was associated in, which of course made it very difficult for Christian operators, Christian businesses to operate in the city. Here you show seeing a very fertile landscape around Thyatira. And this is the madder plant, the purple plant that produced the dye, which was so expensive. This is not from Thyatira, but it's an example of a trade guild monument, where you have, this one is dedicated to Zeus, and you have a banquet, a trade banquet, where businessmen would get together to talk about trade and have a banquet in the temple of their god. Sardis. Sardis was an old and famous city. It had once been the capital of the ancient kingdom of Lydia, where coinage and money was invented. It had long ago been conquered by Cyrus the Persian, and he and his descendants had built a vast road leading off into the east, into the empire, which ended at Sardis. This means that Sardis was the last stop on this huge trade route to the east, which made it very wealthy. But it had this reputation of being conquered, and it shouldn't be conquered. Cyrus and Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire conquered this. But if you look at this picture, this is the Acropolis of Sardis. This is where the center of the city was on this stone outcrop. And you can imagine, how can armies scale that? How can armies take that by surprise? This city should be very, very difficult to take, but it was taken many times in history. And it seemed both of the times it was taken is because the citizens of Sardis were so secure, they felt they were so secure, they didn't even bother looking out to watch for enemy, and the enemy snuck in before they knew it. There is a view looking down from the Acropolis to the rest of the city. That's the gymnasium. Philadelphia. Philadelphia had a small population because it was in an area that had frequent earthquakes. In fact, many times of its history there was an earthquake and its population had to leave the city because it was simply not safe to be there. The last earthquake had been in 17 AD, and many of the population simply hadn't returned home and stayed out living in the countryside, hence the small population, and so probably a small church. It was a significant church, and it remained an important church, though, until at least the 12th century. And as of around 10-15 years ago, there was still a small congregation worshipping in this area. There's a view of the landscape around Philadelphia there. Laodicea. Laodicea was a very prosperous city in John's time, partly due to a trade in dyes and wools. Black woolen goods in particular this city produced. Also had a banking centre. And it was famous for having a medical training school, which was known for producing a powdery substance for eye ailments. Another thing about it was its water supply. Its water came from hot springs 6 miles away and was brought to the city via an aqueduct. Here you can see Hierapolis. This is where the water supply came from. The thermal springs, they're quite famous as a tourist attraction now. People go and bathe in these thermal springs. But these were 6 miles away from Laodicea. There you can see the second picture there is looking towards those thermal springs in the distance, the white in the distance, 6 miles away. And there's some of the pipes and the aqueducts that brought the water to the city. But the problem was it was 6 miles away. If it was 12 miles away, by the time the water reached the city, it would be nice and cold. Or if it was right next to these thermal springs, the city, Laodicea, would have constant hot water supply. But because they were 6 miles away, by the time the water reached the city, it was lukewarm. It was neither hot nor cold, which is why this image is used in them to the letter. Okay, that's the background to this city. You also see in your assignment that there is some observation work to do on the 7 churches. This is because each of these letters follow a basic structure, and you'll be following that to see which of what Jesus and John say to these individual churches. There will be description of Jesus, something that Jesus will commend the church for, something that Jesus will complain about the church. There will be a challenge or a warning of Jesus. Jesus then will promise them something, but also I want you to come up with some kind of application from it, something we can learn from these individual churches, what encouragement we can take. Just to finish these churches off, just want to let you know about how the historicists and some futurists look at these letters. Again, because you have 7 being chosen, people then are suspicious that maybe there's some symbolic reason behind these 7 churches. This is not just about 7 individual churches, but it's painting a bigger picture. And what they see is that each of these churches represent or symbolize an age of the actual entire church. So if revelation of the whole is what will happen throughout church history, the 7 churches show what the character of the church will be like throughout history. So for example, the first one, Ephesus is seen as the apostolic church, the first age of the church, the first century. So the state of the church at the time of writing. A church grappling with false teachers, represented by the Nicolaitans in the letter. A persevering church, laboring after the truth and serving their Lord, the church that first spread the gospel. But a church in all the arguments, in all the false teaching, and all the doctrine arguments, has lost its first love and drifted away from the love that first defined it. Smyrna is often seen as the persecuted church, the church of the early fathers, from around 90 to 313 AD. Roughly speaking, historicists believe this is the church that suffered under the Roman persecution, beginning in earnest under Domitian, all the way up to 313 when Constantine ended the persecution of Christianity. So for them, this is the church of the martyrs, the suffering church, the church that goes through persecution. Pergamon for them represents the imperial church, the church that became dominated by the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor. They would say this was from around 313 to 606 AD. So beginning when Constantine made Christianity legal, and then through him the church had access to more power and privilege, and suddenly found itself to be in charge of the state religion of the Roman Empire. This is also the time period when the emperor raised up the Pope to be above all bishops, and so Rome became the center of the Christian world. Thyatira for them would be the full-blown papal church. What we know now as Roman Catholicism became the most dominant form of Christianity in Europe. So around 606 to 517 AD, roughly covering the Middle Ages period in history, when the Pope was the most powerful figure in all of Europe. This is also the time of the Great Schism between the East and the West, when the church split into 2. And instead of having one church, you now had the Orthodox Church in the East and the Catholic Church in the West. But for the focus for the historicists, of course, is the Catholic Church, the Western Church. They see this to be the Jezebel who persecutes the true church within the papal church. Sardis for them would be the Reformation Church, the church how reformers like Luther and Calvin, all the way through Wesley, so from around 517 to 1793, bring new life to the church. Protestants breaking away from the Catholic Church, restoring biblical authority, but under the opinion of some, not going far enough. Philadelphia for them represents the missionary church, so from 1793 to the present day. How beginning with Wesley and the Great Awakening, other great leaders such as Edwards, Finney and Moody, who lead the church through the open door of evangelism, refocus on evangelism and missions, reaching out to the lost. This inspires then the great missionary movements which are still taking place. For historicists, this is overlapped by the Laodicean church, which for them represents the liberal church, so from around the 19th century to today. So even though the word has spread, evangelism has increased, mission has increased, the church has also, though, become lukewarm, or in their eyes, liberal. They talk about how the scientific methods championed by Darwin and others have affected the church and cooled it down. Scientific approaches like the inductive approach, resulting in a loss of God's way and not regarding the Bible as revealed truth. Historicists then believe that the Philadelphian church and the Laodicean church will exist side by side until Jesus' return. Now, some of these are very good, but it tends to fall apart after Sardis. which is a major problem with the historical view. It's all very good up to the Reformation, Napoleonic War eras. Then it starts to fall apart. But again, let me stress, that's really just the historicists and some futurists who see these churches as different ages of the church. Most views simply see them as these 7 churches in Asia that John is writing to.